For today's episode of Impactful, I am thrilled to be joined by a leading geopolitical expert, founder, and managing partner of Future Map, a best-selling author. He has provided expertise to many governments, including Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Canada, Brazil, the United States, and dozens more. Joining me from Singapore, one of Esquire's 75 most influential people in the 21st century, Dr. Parag Khanna. Dr. Khanna, thank you for joining me from Singapore.
My pleasure. So nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Dr. Khanna, how's the situation with the pandemic in Singapore?
Fortunately, things are recovering. Today actually marks the day where most of the stores and restaurants and other facilities are open. So life is meant to be back to normal. We're lucky to be near the beach as well. So fingers crossed we won't see any more infections. But let's see. It's a very difficult time for the world. But I think, it's good news for countries that are well governed.
Dr. Khanna, the pandemic has changed the world in ways we never thought possible. Its impact on the health systems may be temporary, however, its effects on the global economy will inevitably be lasting. What do you think the impact of the pandemic is and will be on the world's political order?
It's a very good question, and I think that the impact on the geopolitical order is in some ways similar to the impact on the economic order, which is to say that the world has been moving into a direction where there are three distinct regional centers of gravity: North America, Europe, and Asia. And now, as a result of the pandemic, all three of those centers will reinforce themselves. You will see more integration in North America because the United States is trying to pull supply chains back from Asia. Europe is actually trying to do the same thing, and Asia has been accelerating its integration. So as a result, you have a North American system, a European system, and an Asian system. That certainly is the way things are looking economically and geopolitically as well, to some degree, because there is less appetite to have a very distant military and very expensive long-term commitments. The only exception to that rule really is the American military presence in the Pacific region of Asia right now. Other than that, we are moving towards a multi-regional framework. You might call it to each his own, to each her own, is where the world is evolving right now.
As any crisis, the pandemic can exacerbate the existing inequalities, and it has already added on some tension in the international affairs. How different do you think the world will be after the pandemic?
Well, clearly the biggest shifts that everyday people will feel in their normal lives are domestic, and they are economic, and they're about public policy. When it comes to economics, again, before the pandemic, there was a growing pressure to expand fiscal policy, fiscal investments towards social welfare, reducing inequality, creating jobs, and these kinds of things, especially because the monetary policy that played such a prominent role after the last financial crisis had begun to have less and less impact. So the pressures, the fiscal pressures, especially given high unemployment as a result of the pandemic, those will be lasting consequences. And that, therefore, has a very strong political implication. We will have to shift towards governments being much more efficient with all of these resources that they are now spending. The demands for accountability are higher than ever, and that's why we see such strong protest movements all across the world. This also has international implications. We've seen, for example, again, in the United States, the fiscal policy is what's being attached to it is a directive to get companies to nearshore their industry and create jobs in America. The European Union has said that support will only be given to companies that are expanding their employment in the European Union and that bring back their foreign domiciles, for example. And you also have the regulatory protectionist measures being undertaken in Asia. So around the world, this protectionism is a consequence of domestic politics, and it's a consequence of the demands for greater fiscal expenditure domestically. And all of that, again, contributes to this broader regionalization and regionalism in the world that we will see more and more of moving forward.
You're the author of 6 best-selling books, with the latest, The Future is Asian. It's one of the actually top 10, Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Toqayev's top 10 favorite books of all time. So in it, you talk about Asia's resurgence as a collective resurgence of Asia as a system, the Asianization of Asia. What did you mean by that?
Yes, and this is particularly a phenomenon that has been unfolding for exactly the last 30 years. What happened 30 years ago? Well, of course, it's a moment that everyone in Kazakhstan knows. It was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And since that time, 3 decades ago, we have seen the ability of Asian countries to rediscover those ancient Silk Roads, as we call them, the trade linkages and the partnerships across all of Asia's subregions, not just Northeast Asia, not just Southeast Asia, also South Asia, Central Asia, and West Asia. All of them have been deepening their interdirectional relations in trade, in investment, finance, commerce, even demographic flows, travel, tourism, and so forth. Also learning across governments and infrastructural linkages in the last 30 years. So this is the Asianization of Asia, and it will, I believe, continue to expand because there are so many complementarities across Asian governments and Asian societies: industrial, financial, human capital, technology. All of these we have in general proximity to each other, but we could be trading even more with each other. Then also new institutions that are being formed so that Asians can govern Asia. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Many different frameworks are evolving. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP trade agreement as well. So the institutionalization, the growing intensity of relations among Asians, these are all some of the elements of this Asianization process.
You said many times that May 2017, when the famous Belt and Road Initiative of China was launched, marks the pivotal moment in history. It marks the start of the Asia-led world order. How do you think the Asia has arrived to the point of leading in this modern world?
The most important thing for people to remember is that for Asia to lead the world, Asia simply has to lead itself, because Asia is more than half the world's population, and it is about half of the world's GDP. So Asian powers do not have to extend their influence to the South Atlantic Ocean to be globally significant. One of the things I point out in the book is that it's actually the reverse. If you think about the 16th century, when very small European nations, monarchies, became global powers, how and why did they become global powers? Because of their colonies in Asia. You cannot be a global power without being a power in Asia. But an Asian nation or empire or state can be a global power simply by being a power in Asia, because the gravity of Asia in the world is larger than any other part of the world. So there's a uniqueness to the geography that we are in at this moment of history. And the more Asia continues to grow economically, which of course no other region of the world is, only Asia will grow in the coming years. And if the geopolitical stability can be maintained, if we can continue to bring down borders where it is most mutually beneficial for countries, then this Asianization process will continue.
One of the big stories that are happening in Asia is the rise of China and its famous Belt and Road Initiative. Kazakhstan's leadership has embraced and is committed to the Belt and Road Initiative. Kazakhstan has largely benefited from the renewed and new infrastructure, from better access to capital markets. How do you think the Belt and Road Initiative is playing out for the entire Central Asia, and what do you think its future will be?
I do think of the Belt and Road Initiative as a good example of what I think of as inside-out governance orders and frameworks and clubs and processes from Asia. But Belt and Road is not representative of all of Eurasian infrastructure finance. The deeper process that again goes back 30 years is Eurasian infrastructural connectivity. And the driver of that process, number one, has been the European Union through the eastward expansion. The number of members of the European Union has grown from 12 to 27, and it will continue to expand. And then moving from east to west, it is the role of Japan and the Asian Development Bank that in the 1990s was most prominent in helping to invest in and modernize former Soviet republics, South Asian countries, Southeast Asia. Now, Belt and Road is China's effort that adds to that process, and it adds a very substantial amount of resources. Now, the volume of Chinese commitments, whether it is investment, whether it is lending, credit, trade, other mechanisms, will increase and decrease over time. It may depend on the pandemic, it may depend on bilateral relations, may depend on political risk, may depend on conflict, but the broader commitment that Europe, Japan, India, Russia, China, multilateral organizations, it is that sum total of activity that we need to be focused on. What Kazakhstan has done extremely well is to make sure that it is friendly with Japan, with India, with Europe, with the United States, with Russia, and also with China. And this is an extraordinary diplomatic balancing act. But of course, this is the virtue of Kazakhstan's geography, to be in a situation where all of the different powers involved in this Asianization and Eurasian integration see Kazakhstan as an essential partner. And therefore, as important as China is today, one should never confuse China as the only player interested. And so I like to point out that there is a saying, all roads lead to Rome. And I always say that China builds a lot of roads, but all roads don't lead to Beijing, because there is an east-west Silk Road, there are north-south Silk Roads. The new Silk Roads are really about everyone connecting to everyone, not just to what degree they are connected to China. And that represents the true flourishing of Asia. Let me remind you that we are already moving into what I call the fourth wave of Asian growth. China was the third wave, the tiger economies were the second wave, and Japan was the first wave. We are already in a world today where South and Southeast Asia, the countries from Pakistan through India, through ASEAN, represent 2.5 billion people that have a much lower standard of living, but much younger populations than China. Some of them are growing faster than China. They are capturing supply chains and foreign investment that companies are pulling out of China, and they have an enormous scope to expand and grow. In less than 10 years, the GDP of these countries will be equal to that of China. So we must view Asia as something much larger than merely China, because it most certainly is demographically, and it very soon will be economically as well.
Kazakhstan has been lucky in the sense that most of its oil and gas deposits were discovered after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Once the country became an independent state, the country has capitalized on its natural resources and built its economy and made itself a significant geopolitical leader and player in the region. Moving into the future, what do you think Kazakhstan should be focusing on, both in terms of its economy and also in terms of its international cooperation?
Kazakhstan for the last 30 years has been very consistent, not only in seeking to maximize the value of its recently discovered hydrocarbon resources, but also to maintain good relations with its neighbors, to build connective infrastructure so that its resources can better reach markets, so that it can have more trading partners, to compensate for being a landlocked country, as well as emphasizing diversification. And I've been watching Kazakhstan's different iterations of diversification plans into agriculture, into biotechnology, into clean energy now as well, and quite a few other areas. And I find this very, very promising. One of the other remarkable turnarounds of the last several years has been that Kazakhstan's population is now growing quite robustly as well, because many countries in the post-colonial and post-Soviet space have been losing populations over the last 25, 30 years. But what we see with Kazakhstan now is that has turned around, and people are coming to Kazakhstan because they see its stability. So that also helps to drive the diversification of the economy into the services area as well. So these are all things that Kazakhstan is doing very well. Then, of course, there are the internal regulatory reforms, economic reforms, creation of the Astana International Financial Center, attracting more foreign investment. So all of these forces and processes actually reinforce each other very strongly. And those are the things that I think are most important genuinely for a country to continue or maintain or expand its growth. Now, let me also mention for all of your viewers, right now at this time, given the virus, most countries are retreating. Most countries are pulling back. Most countries are afraid. Most countries are resource constrained. It's very rare right now for a country to be acting like Kazakhstan. to have confidence, to know how it will navigate the situation, and to continue to move forward with the plans that it has had. This is the test of resilience at a time like this.
Well, Dr. Khan, I enjoyed tremendously reading your book, The Future is Asian. Are you working on anything right now?
I am, in fact. I'm working on what is a book about the future of human geography. As you may know, the world population is actually starting to level off. It's starting to plateau at roughly 8 billion, 8.5 billion people. And that's not a situation that we have encountered in many, many, many centuries, really since the last Black Death of the 14th century. But now our growth depends to some degree on having human capital, on having equitable growth, on really harnessing the potential of our population. So I believe the war for talent is going to accelerate. And this is, of course, ironic, because right now we are in a situation where borders are closed because of the pandemic, and there is protectionism, nationalism, and xenophobia. I'm arguing that if you look just 5 years ahead and you think about how difficult it will be to generate growth with an aging population and a finite number of young people, actually countries will be competing to recruit young people and young talent. So the future of human geography will determine the winners and losers in economics, and to some degree in geopolitics as well. So this is the arc of the story of the book that I'm writing just now.
Well, I look forward to it coming out and to reading it.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was a wonderful conversation. I hope to do this again in person on the other occasion.
Likewise, we'll see you in Kazakhstan.